Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Institute of Coaching and our CoachX conversation. I'm Carol Kauffman, the founder of the Institute of Coaching, and also, as of 48 hours ago, a leadership advisor at Egon Zehnder. And Cynthia is, right now, she's the co-lead of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Egon Zehnder, which is an executive search and leadership advisory firm. We did a webinar last week, and if you didn't get to see that, go to the instituteofcoaching.org and you look around and there'll be a click to it and you can listen to it. So today, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some of the very toughest questions that DEI officers and many of us can face. These are the questions that take your breath away. You do not know what to say, but Cynthia does, because this is her space. So what's really lovely is one of the people who was at our webinar last time, Monica Molina Austin, she wrote in a great question, which I'll ask Cynthia, and then this got us going. She said, I notice when we talk about ethnic diversity and underrepresentation, it can move to the, well, all lives matter response. And how have you handled that, Cynthia?
Yeah, this was a great question that Monica sent. And actually, we had a really nice online dialogue about it as well. And my approach to this question, I'll start by saying there can be two responses to this question. So Monica named one. So we'll go there first. I wanted to, the conversation starts about one life matters and somebody wants to expand it into all lives matter. Do we lean into that? And I do think that particularly in the United States, but increasingly outside of the United States, the conversation about diversity really is expansive. So my first thought is, yes, you do lean into the idea that diversity and embracing diversity, including diversity, is broad. And there can be bigger gaps that exist in an organization. The gaps are not all equal in terms of representation gaps or inclusion gaps. So when an organization acknowledges that, then yes, all lives matter. And we have some specific gaps that are bigger, more urgent that we need to address. And when we address these gaps for this population that is in particularly low representation or particularly not feeling included right now, we will improve the environment for all. So that connects those two pieces.
That's wonderful. So basically, first of all, you don't shy away or say no, but really, as you say, lean in and really think about the larger look from the whole organization. And I like that, the unequal gaps. It sort of makes it systems. So here's another killer question. And you get this a lot. Again, Cynthia is a search person, and so she's talking to a lot of chief diversity officers and then a lot of CEOs and people who are on the receiving end of her diversity consultations. And they might say something like that reveals they think the diverse candidate is less qualified. And the client might say, well, listen, we don't want to lower the bar. Okay, what would you say to that?
Yeah, this lower the bar comment is remarkably common. So I think probably everybody that's viewing this might have heard some version of this. So I'll say first, this is never about increasing inclusive hiring practices is never about lowering the bar. It's about ensuring that we are addressing any possible bias in who's in the consideration set. And everybody that comes in the consideration set is going to meet and clear the bar. We feel it's important from an executive search point of view to answer that comment unequivocally. We are never lowering the bar. We are increasing the consideration set to a more diverse slate of candidates, perhaps than you've seen before, that all meet and clear the bar. And my encouragement to everybody who has to address this question is to answer that unequivocally, because it is a frustration that there are assumptions made that, because one holds an underrepresented identity, that they're not deserving of a place on the slate. So it's important for us to, I think, dispel this myth as clearly and unequivocally as possible.
So I have a question about that. So I'm imagining being in your situation when that happens, that I would get angry. So I'm wondering, how do you manage the emotions that come up when somebody says this kind of, well, we're not going to lower the bar, Cynthia? What do you do inside?
Well, the first thing actually is preparing. You mentioned at the start of this conversation, Carol, we get these questions and they take our breath away. And even that state of feeling unmoored, right? All kinds of emotions come up. Anger could be one. I do think the more that we mentally plan and prepare, we know these questions do come. And you very, very kindly said Cynthia knows how to answer these. It's kind of that I practice how to answer these, right? It's that I have been exposed to these questions enough that, I've already given them thought and have a response at the ready. And this is a question that comes up, this comment of lowering the bar comes up often enough that my encouragement is be mentally ready, and then your emotions stay in check. Then it is, a calm conversation around exactly what I mentioned. This philosophy is about expanding consideration sets, not lowering bars. I think in general in this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there also is always recognition that we're meeting people where they are. And being able to approach any conversation that way, that person may not be where I am or where I want them to be, but if I can meet them where they are and move them a bit, then, that's a successful conversation from a DEI practitioner point of view.
That's really fascinating. I was just doing a training for a number of leaders at Egon Zehnder about developing coaching skills. And one of the things we were talking about is what makes a great coach, what makes a great leader. And what we talked about is what you do is you walk over to the bridge to where the other person is and stand next to them and look at the river together. And how to do that even when they've said something that at the moment feels incendiary. And then you can then go back on the bridge and back over it, seeing how far they will come with you. But I think what's beautiful about what you're saying is not getting into a defense stance or even an activist stance, just a different assumption. I love that. Of course, we wouldn't lower the bar, but you're now getting to see a wider range of people to pick from. That's very lovely. So the next one is the real igniting question. And, mostly you just see this written in Republican newspapers, but it's like, okay, so listen, I understand you hired so-and-so. You've just taken a job away from a white man who's more qualified than this person is. What would you say?
So this is an incendiary question. I'll start with a response, and then I'll go back to actually the first question, the earlier question you asked, like how do you stay calm in a situation? Because that one is can be a bit incendiary. So the first thing is in terms of response, I think again, unequivocally to say this is about bringing the best. That decision was about bringing the best person to the role. As an executive search, consultant, that is how we respond, I think consistently to questions around placements. And in that case, once again, I think our opportunity is to say unequivocally that is about bringing the best person to the role. There are assumptions that are buried in that statement, right? Somebody was less qualified for the role. And in some ways, I think there are situations where you just don't want to address the poor assumptions. So depending on, some other situational context, I think sometimes the simplest answer is the best one, which is to say that was about bringing the best person for the role. Mm-hmm. Situationally, There have been times when expanding upon a response to say, there are elements of like added perspective that person brings to the leadership team. That concept of added perspective is actually one that we talk about a lot at the beginning of a hiring process, to acknowledge from the start what perspectives are missing from this group, and how do we ensure that the slate we are bringing you to consider for the role is really inclusive of those perspectives you're missing. So you can imagine what it would be like if you brought those new perspectives into the conversation. So situationally, and again, testing openness of the person on the other side of the conversation. With an incendiary comment like that, it might not be a very open conversation, right? So the simplest answer may be the best.
But I think that, again, that's where what you said earlier is, how do you go over to the bridge? For someone like that, data might answer the question. Looking at the organization as a whole answers the question. But most of all, speak more about what you said about what do you do to stay calm when you get one of these questions that feels painful and makes you assume bad intent from the other person, which may not be true.
Yeah. Some of the emotional preparation that has helped me in this situation is recognizing that change, any experience of change for people is a loss of some kind, right? So what's inherent in that comment, right? You've taken the role from somebody of X, a white man who was more qualified. Underneath that is this fear of loss, fear of change of the status quo, and that's interpreted as loss. And when I can walk to the side of the bridge with them in your metaphor, right? When I can walk to the side of the bridge to say, how would someone experience this, this type of situation as a loss? Can I have empathy for that feeling and help them see it as not a loss, but a gain more broadly? That's the opportunity. But I do think that in this DEI work, a lot of what people grapple with, because we're asking people to change behaviors and change mindsets. And those changes, partly because they're uncomfortable, partly because we were so comfortable in the way that things were, change feels like loss. So having empathy for that, I think, is really critical.
This may seem a little bizarre association, but I think of Star Trek. And I hear Jean-Luc Picard saying, to boldly go where no one has gone before. And I was thinking about that once, and it came to me as like, oh, if you're boldly going where no one has gone before, you're lost. And that's what it is. And so really you're talking about how do you navigate this new terrain, but to appreciate for those who feel they are the terrain that's being intruded upon.
Yes.
That there is, will I lose power? Will I lose control? Will I lose my specialness? So I think seeing it from that empathic perspective is a good discipline.
Yeah.
As well as checking your bias yourself at the door, that if you're asking questions like this, you're a jerk or you're racist or whatever, as opposed to you might just be lost, or you might even be being the mouthpiece of the organization.
Right.
And so there's one last question in the super incendiary part, which is, let's say they reject the diverse candidate and their argument is, well, we're not really going to do that. It's for their own good that we don't select them because we wouldn't want them to feel uncomfortable here. Yeah. And what would you do with that one?
Yeah. This to me, so my response to that is the opportunity is to address the environment, right? This is to address the environment and to make it a fertile ground for that individual to join. And to see the benefits of, we talk a lot, the term culture fit has been used in so many ways to sort of filter people out with exactly the type of comment that you described. And it to them feels like we're just looking for somebody who naturally fits here. I and many other people have tried to shift the conversation to what is culturally additive, and how do we ensure that we create an environment where we are ready to add people who are different, who bring a different perspective and bring a different point of view, and see the benefit of that to the organization, which is, again, where that concept of culturally additive comes from. So instead of screening out for culture fit and it's for their own good and they wouldn't fit here and they'd be unhappy, it shifts the conversation to how do we create an environment where we can add them and we'll all be better for it because that person brings an additional perspective that we're lacking today. The hope always is before that, because you said the scenario can sometimes be when they've already gone there. They've already made that decision. Oh, this person doesn't fit. My hope would be we actually start these conversations earlier, right? Early in a process to nip that possible bias in the bud and say, as we are looking for the right person for this role, we're actively going to think about culturally additive concepts. We're actively going to think about what would somebody bring because they're different to the culture that we have today. And that also nips that conversation in the bud before it ever happens.
So in terms of, let's back up a little bit. So I've done a lot of these big transformation programs and, in the top 200 or 300 people. And again and again and again, you see there's a lot of diversity, like 3 steps down from the CEO, a little less diversity, 2 steps down. Then when you get to the exco, 10% women at best, 5 to 10% of anyone of color at best. And, I've been in a couple of situations like that when I will say to the CEO, what's going on here? And then they like, yes, we're working on it. Or yes, you never get maybe now you're getting a little bit of it's a problem. But as you come in and they haven't asked you about to come in for diversity. You've just come in because you're a search person, a consultant, and all your jobs aren't about diversity. How do you begin that conversation when you look at the terrain and go, there's not a lot of diversity here?
Yeah. I do think it starts with active noticing, meaning out loud noticing. A situation like you just described to like what you said, you've noticed it. A way to raise it is, I noticed that your leadership team is made up of XYZ. Any thoughts on that? Great coaching questions, right? Any reflections on that? I do think that those conversations are best had individually. It creates a different layer of possible defensiveness if that noticing, even as gentle as it is, if that noticing happens in a public forum, it is more likely to elicit oh, everything's fine, or we're working on it, or, what have you type of response, as opposed to a really open reflection on, oh, I've noticed that and I've worried about it too. And by the way, in some situations, they haven't noticed. A real honest to goodness response from some individuals in that situation could be, I haven't wondered about that, right? I've got a great leadership team and, all of those kinds of things. So I think anyone who wants to sort of engage in that conversation has to know there is that full spectrum of possible responses. And one that is a little bit less aware or a little bit more defensive, is going to require some slow chipping away and invitations in. I'll pause there. Is that resonating, Carol? Have you been in situations like that?
I've been very protected in situations like that because I'm an external person coming in. So I'm coming in and noticing, and if the CEO flips out, I'm not losing my job. Right. This is just one client. So I think it's much harder when you have a lot of skin in the game and you're speaking out, and this is where you work. So I was going to shift from the external perspective to the internal perspective in terms of what kind of struggles are you seeing with people who aren't coming in as recruiters or coaches? Maybe they are the chief diversity officers. What could be useful to our group of coaches? And what are you hearing?
Yeah. I often have called the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer a CEO whisperer. This role, and we talked about it a little bit in our last conversation, is one that can very much be a coach to the CEO on these topics. I think what's interesting about the role of Chief Diversity Officer is there's a little bit of license, similar to the license you described of being an outside professional in the space. There's a little bit of license that the Office of Chief Diversity Officer is given to notice these things. And still to invite people into that observation in a way that doesn't shame, create defensiveness, or call them out, but to encourage people to be curious. Why are we collectively in this situation, in this culture? Every Chief Diversity Officer is definitely actively meeting people where they are every day on this conversation. But I think the reason the office was almost created, or maybe this is just hindsight, was because then you have somebody you've given them the expectation to say, help me see things I don't see, and help me practice things in a new way that I'm not practicing inside the organization.
Mm-hmm. What really strikes me is that a lot of the enemy is shame.
Yes.
How do you address this without shaming?
Yes.
And I hear a lot of that going over to the bridge, managing your emotions, that it's just very, very challenging. And the role of the Chief Diversity Officer just sounds it requires such agility. So can you tell us a little bit about the experience of the Chief Diversity Officers that you've been working with?
Yeah, I would love to. And there's a wonderful community of Chief Diversity Officers who, by the way, also really support each other in this work, because one of the number one things that I hear in the experiences of Chief Diversity Officers is it's very taxing. It's an emotionally taxing role. It is such a high empathy role on all fronts, right? Meeting everybody where they are on different ends of the spectrum, because also Chief Diversity Officers are giving counsel to people who are frustrated that things are not changing more quickly. And they're giving counsel to people who might be slow to change. So those Chief Diversity Officers are stretched in both directions. And it's tiring at the end of the day. So that's one of the most common things that I hear. And then you add on top of that many people who hold the role of Chief Diversity Officer themselves hold a minority identity or an intersection of minority identities. So they're experiencing many of the same things that the role was intended to address in terms of, am I always seen for my whole self? Do I have equal access to sponsorship relationships as some of my peers who hold different identities or sit in different functions? So they hold their own complexities while holding space and empathy for everybody else that's on their different individual journeys in this work. So I have a ton of, the highest regard for the people that I have met who have committed themselves to doing this work. It asks a lot of you.
So I'm going to post a picture of this next week on my LinkedIn post, but I came across this wonderful painting. I think it was just by a high school student, and you had a picture of a woman of color, and you saw the sadness, and then you had a mask like this that she was holding of a very well made up, well presented woman. And I was thinking about trying to come up with a caption to describe it, and finally I thought of I get tired of holding this up. and then the emotional labor. Because I think what you're talking about is just massive emotional labor that's required in this role. Yeah. And therefore you need a lot of support.
Yes. Yes, you need a lot of support. You need a lot of support from the community of others who share this work, right? Just we all seek community of those we can bond with. And I think that's the other reason why one thing I hear from chief diversity officers is I need a team. I need to know my management is engaged in this. So there's also just the practicalities of support in doing the work, driving the change in an organization. So it's emotional support, it's tactical support, and it's, principled support, I guess, I would say, from the senior management team in an organization.
Yeah. And so in some of our comments, so Dr. Gina Davis talked about, it's important to have courage and be willing to speak the truth to power if you're going to be chief diversity officer. Mm-hmm. And can you just tell us a little bit about that? Because that seems extremely accurate.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. And I'll give maybe a story that a chief diversity officer shared with me. This particular individual is preparing her CEO for a town hall. And this was last summer, so the town hall was definitely going to involve questions around culture, questions about the company's stance on DEI, which is why the chief diversity officer was prepping the CEO. And she is a black woman, and she had a very direct conversation with the CEO about how some things that he has said in the past, things like lowering the bar, actually, I think was one of the comments, how that is felt by women and people of color in his organization. So that when he was preparing for this town hall, he would have a higher level of consciousness of the way that he talks and the way that it's received by different people of different identities. That was a real truth to power moment. It was done in private. It was done in a safe space for the CEO, but it was, an incredibly important moment of those truth to power coaching moments, because he could have done unwitting damage. That's something that I talk about, sometimes with people, is doing unwitting harm by not having your consciousness raised. That's something actually that chief diversity officers want to protect the organization from and protect the CEO from. So that's why truth to power, I think, is really in practice in this role.
It's interesting about safety, because I'm coaching a CEO of a Fortune 20 firm, and he was about to do one of these big town halls over the summer and was talking about being afraid of using the wrong words and offending people, and then having to fight being silenced. So last question here from Debbie Godfrey. How do you avoid having the hire not feel like a token? What's your thought on that?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. One is, in the experience of getting to know a whole person through their selection process for a role. And I would say we talk about this with board candidates and executive candidates. Our coaching is like, you got to get to know this whole person and demonstrate your interest in their totality, right? The functional experience they bring, the company experience they bring, yes, their identity as well. But what creates a tokenist experience is when there is anything that smells like the only reason you're reaching out to me is because of my identity. The only reason you're interested in getting to know me is because I'm Black and you don't have any Black people on your board or on your executive team. So being authentic, getting to know the whole person is critical. And upon a hiring decision, right, going back to that, how do you create the cultural dynamics where you are really inviting somebody in, really actively integrating them, their whole person? That would be the other piece of it, right? After selection, and then yes, you're accepting them for their whole identity, including that minority identity, and you're incorporating their whole person.
Cynthia, thank you. This has been brilliant. And I think it would be incredibly useful for people. I think we'll transcribe it and turn it into a blog.